So, Colin, I wanted to reveal to our listeners a little behind the scenes. You wrote me last week and said something had come up and asked if we could delay our usual recording date until this week, today, when we're
Yep.
recording. And that was the best news I had gotten in so long. Because I didn't want to force us to delay. We have busy schedules. It's hard for us to connect sometimes. So I like to keep our calendar. But oh man, last week it was so bad.
Bad news, is it?
Yeah. The problem was that over the course of many months, I kept saying yes to things because those deadlines were way in the future. The future being last week.
Yes, I see.
Yeah,
and it all culminated in you pulling your hair out.
I should correct. It hasn't all culminated. It's been this cascading series of disasters all summer, and it's not going to end for another 2 months.
And there was me feeling guilty that I suggested that we needed to move it. I didn't realize that you were so easily pleased, mate.
Oh, I'm very pleased. To be clear, I still want you to feel guilty. You should still feel bad. No, it's been a terrible summer from the perspective of time management for Ryan Hamilton. But the upside is that shortly after that, you sent me that email, and I expressed my very high willingness to actually postpone that recording. It recalled to me that we've never actually talked about planning fallacy in our episodes. So this is a cognitive bias that I fell prey to again this summer, I guess over the past year. And so I figure we can talk about it so that I feel less dumb for having done this.
Yeah, no, and to be honest, mate, as soon as you told me about it, and I thought to myself, yeah, bloody hell, I've suffered from this. And then I thought, yeah, everybody listens suffers from this. So I thought it'd be a great episode to explain to people what in the hell's happening. And moreover, I think some of the implications of it. So,
agreed.
So if ever you're like Ryan and you've got too much to do because you've agreed to do too many things, then listen to this. So what's happening from a human perspective?
So this is yet another of these cognitive biases that was identified or popularized by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. So these are guys we've talked about a lot.
And a bias, sorry, just for the uninitiated, a bias basically is like a rule of thumb.
That's a heuristic is a rule of thumb.
Sorry, I apologize.
Heuristics often lead to biases, which is...
A bias is the way that you look at something.
Exactly. So a bias is where you make a decision or event some preference or judgment that's kind of...
Yes, I was getting the two muddled up.
Consistently wrong. So,
but
it is a bias that is rooted in optimism and affected by the way that we kind of think about the future. Essentially, the planning fallacy is this idea that, well, let me give you an example. Suppose that I came to you, Colin, and said, hey, I'd really love it if you could deliver a keynote address at a conference that I'm running next Tuesday. There's a very good chance that you would say, I'm busy. I don't have time to put together a keynote address and practice it and get out there. I've got other stuff that's going on in my life. If I were to come to you, though, and say, hey, would you deliver a keynote at my conference that I'm running in 6 months? There's a very good chance that you would say, that's not a problem at all.
Yes.
You've given enough keynotes. Maybe that's a bad example. Suppose that this were something that required a lot of your time and effort to plan.
Yes, I mean, there are clearly a number of variables that go into that conversation. But
but the idea is that when we have to do something in the very near future, we're well aware of all of the commitments that we've already made and that we would have to squeeze this into, and we're kind of appreciating how much time it would take to prepare for that. But when I ask you about something that's 6 months out, you're like, oh, I'll be able to have time for that. And the reality is, over and over again, that we don't take the full 6 months to prep.
Sure.
Instead, we kind of like, we'll do that in the future. And then we
Sure.
often end up in a place like I did last week, like I'm continuing to do throughout the rest of the summer and well into the fall, where we are still in a place where we're preparing on kind of a compressed time horizon. And we just haven't anticipated all the other things that are going to be occupying our time, all the other demands that we will have. And so
So,
we overestimate the free amount of free time that we will have in the future relative to in the near future right now.
so let me ask you a few questions then,
Yeah.
because some of this is just about planning, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I've always liked the model that I first read in the Seven Habits of Highly Effective People, the Stephen Covey,
Stephen
yeah,
Covey. Yeah.
where he talks about the four box model between importance and urgent. So, and what you're describing is that you've ended up doing things that are important and urgent. But if you had done them when they were, if you'd done the important thing, if you'd done it when it was important and
Yeah.
not urgent,
Yeah.
then you would have been fine. And doesn't that therefore just speak to the fact that you hadn't thought about it enough? And
Yes.
how does that is that sort of a trait of the bias?
Yeah. So there are actually like dozens of explanations for the planning fallacy. Like a whole
Yeah,
bunch of psychologists have worked on this. So we've got like everybody agrees that it happens. Like
yeah,
you said, like when you find out about this, you're like, oh, thank goodness I'm not the only one. Like I'm
sure,
so glad other people are this dumb.
yeah, yeah,
So this is a
sure,
very universal phenomenon. As
sure,
to why it happens, there are lots of explanations that have some merit, that have some
sure,
support for it. I prefer the explanation that leans in the direction that you're heading now, and we'll talk about that in a second. But it's essentially when I ask you whether you're willing to do something, you create a mental simulation of how hard would it be for me to do that? Like, how much time would it take
sure,
me to do that? And then how much time do I think that I have? And when it's close, then the urgency of it is very salient. And you're like, oh, like I would need to carve out time to make this happen. Like this is not going to fit naturally into my day.
sure,
Um, where when it's far out in the future, you're like, oh, I'll have time. Like
yeah, sure.
I'll be able to find time to do that. And so it is very much kind of a failure of simulation. Like you don't appreciate all the things that you will have to do in the coming months that are also going to be eating up at your time and kind of creating their own urgency.
Isn't it also about the? So if I think about these things, I think about there are obviously different types of people. Okay, so some people are organised, some people aren't.
Yep.
Some people are disciplined, some people aren't.
Yep.
Yeah, and in my view, that's where it starts to come to, which is going. Are you optimistically looking at your discipline and organizational skills that you haven't, that you don't plan enough for it? So if I've got a friend of mine who will say yes to everything basically, yeah, but he needs organizing. You actually end up having to organize things for him, you know, and he hasn't got the discipline to do it. And I don't know whether it's organizational skills or discipline that actually. So he doesn't have the discipline to input the organizational skills that would actually deliver the event. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, people exist on a spectrum across all kinds of different dimensions, all kinds of different attributes, and for this too, if you are highly disciplined and highly organized, the planning fallacy will not be as much of a problem for you.
Sure.
Empirically, when they look at this, though, it tends to be a problem for a lot of people. So like some of the early studies on this, for example, they asked students who had to write a senior thesis, it was like a very big summative paper.
Sure.
Say like, how long is it going to take you to do this? Like, what's the worst case scenario? If everything goes
Sure.
wrong, then how long will it take you to do this? The majority of students, it actually took
Underestimate.
them much longer than their worst
Yeah.
case scenario.
Yeah.
Now there were, even in those studies, there were something like a third or so of people who came in at about their estimated time frame. So again,
Sure.
this is not that something that happens to everyone all the time.
No. Sure.
And if
So
you have a lot of discipline, then it's less of a problem for you.
Yeah, so let's talk about this from a customer experience perspective for a moment, okay? Because
Right?
you've raised a couple of interesting things there. So we do this emotional signature research,
Yep.
okay, which is where we look at what drives value for an organization. We've been doing it since 2005, okay, so we know how to do it. When a client asks us, how long does it take to do? The answer is about 3 months. Okay. 50% of the clients that we have will turn around and say, couldn't we do it a bit quicker? And we go, yeah, but the 3 months is not us.
Yeah.
The problem is you, effectively. It's we need to get people together. So you're going to have a whole conversation around how many people do we need to get together. You're going to have a whole conversation around, well, when can we do it? So, we can do it in 6 weeks, but it's whether you can do your part of this in 6 weeks. And I would say out of that 50% that ask us that, 25% still want us to plan that it will be delivered, in 6 weeks. And then I would say 99% of them never do it in that timescale. Yeah. And I guess that's that whole bit. The reason I'm mentioning all this to you is it's that whole bit around not understanding the detail that fits underneath it to be able to, and underestimating the detail that, and we know all that detail, and we've done it many times, but they don't. And we obviously challenge them then and tell them all these things, and they start to realize. But it's you still get that effect, don't you? Does that make sense?
I mean, you raise a really interesting wrinkle on this, which is planning fallacy, as I've read about it, has always been studied at the individual level. So I'm planning for myself. When you look at it at an organizational level, I assume it just gets worse, right? Because I have a hard time in like modeling my own future behavior, and I oversimplify my own future behavior. But if I'm now modeling my behavior and your behavior, I assume that my model for you is even more simple. Like as I project out to other people, it's like, oh yeah, we'll be able to get people together and organize. Like we'll be able to get you this information, no problem.
Sure.
And so I assume that it's even worse within organizations.
Well, I think the interesting thing for me is you're still talking about an individual. So if in the situation with this research, we're still talking to an individual, a client, a customer within the clients, and it's them then who are then going back and articulating that within the organization. But I think the other part for me is that as I looked into this, is if you think about it again from a customer experience perspective, the danger is that it happens across the organization.
Yes.
So let me tell you a story that may highlight it. We got called into a healthcare organization, and they basically install healthcare systems, so sort of back end systems and all that type of stuff. And the interesting thing was that prior to the installation, they were being seen as very efficient and a very good organization. Okay. after they went through after the system was installed and they went through the onboarding and everything else, because of the poor planning that was taking place, okay, it massively affected what that organization saw them as. Okay, the other interesting part for us was you then had sort of three different types of customer. You had the decision maker, the person who said, yes, we'll buy that system. You had the project manager who was effectively going, right, well, we'll manage the whole project. And you had, and this is within the client, you then had you then had the user. And it was effectively like a pyramid. So the users hated the company, the healthcare systems company, hated them because of all the problems that they caused, and the implications and the late hours that they had to work, and that got less the further up the organization that you went, but it still reached the decision maker, because the decision maker was then going, well, I gather this isn't going very well, and you haven't hit these milestones, and all of those other things. So it made me wonder whether that sort of planning bias becomes endemic within the organization, and there's a lack of planning across that piece as well, because it affects the customer.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think that the scenario you laid out, where the client is pushing you to, have some stricter deadlines, some earlier deadlines, that you want to please your client, you want to please your customer. I think
Sure.
the planning fallacy is at least one cause of over promising and under delivering, where we
Yes.
we don't anticipate, oh, we've got other clients who also have needs, and that's going to be competing with our time. And then
Sure.
there's other like complications that could arise. And it's this failure to simulate all of the contingencies that lead
Yes.
to us over promising, yeah, we should be able to make that work, and
Yeah.
then end up missing those deadlines for that reason.
The interesting bit, though, from the healthcare provider that I was just talking about, the healthcare solutions, was they did this time and time again.
Yeah.
So it wasn't that, it's not something that was new. This happened repeatedly, which is the reason they ended up calling us in, basically, to go
So
help. And
I
what could they do?
wonder if, and this may not fit with the scenario they were in, but I wonder if that upfront part was something that was more systemized, more regular. So like that kind of implement, that sales part was the same for all clients. So just like when somebody comes to you and says, we want an emotional signature, you've done that enough times that you know how long that takes. If that
Sure.
part was like pretty regular, and they could say, no, that like this process is going to take us 4 months, but
Sure.
then the implementation stage was like customized, and so it was like different for each client, and that led to more of this bias being able to creep in. So it could take anywhere between 6 months and a year. Let's optimistically say it's going to take 6 months for this client, when in reality it never quite.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's so many things that come in here, aren't there? So again, prior, as I was thinking about this prior to us talking today, it was making me think about, um, you know, generally sales organizations tend to be more optimistic
Yes.
and overpromise
Yes.
than the engineering side of the house. Generally, the engineering side of the house, because they normally get left holding the baby, tend to be more pessimistic, in my view, than and they want much more time between them. So I think
Hold it. Can we
part of
pause
the
for a second? I
yeah, go
love
on.
the fact that your English idiom for something problematic is left holding the baby. Like that's the phrase that you use for, oh man, if things have really hit the wall, that means you're holding a baby. And
You
as
are.
a parent of multiple children, not a bad idiom. I approve of it. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. But so if with the healthcare company, that was part of the problem,
Yeah.
was the salespeople overpromised. Okay.
Yep.
And the engineers then went in and had to clear up not the mess. I mean, that's an exaggeration, because there were a number of other challenges within there. But the interesting thing was the organization kept repeating the problem. And it goes back to the conversation that we had. We'll put a link in the show notes. So if your colleague, I forget her name now, had a book about, we interviewed her on a new book about saying no.
Vanessa Patrick.
And
Yes.
that's it. Thank you. We'll put a link in the show notes. But, that whole issue of being able to say no is so important, isn't it?
Yeah. So I mentioned there were a whole bunch of explanations that have been proposed. One of them is impression management, the idea that we may overpromise because we want to look good up front, thinking we can make up for it later. So a little bit like leaving late somewhere and then planning on speeding on the roads in order to make up for it later. So you might try to manage your impressions, and it's usually not a great idea because we don't appreciate how much time it's going to take, like how little resource we'll have later. In terms of other explanations that have been proposed, there's this wishful thinking idea. There's something called focalism, which is the idea that we tend to focus just on certain points of information and neglect others. There's a self-serving bias where we tend to think of ourselves as more competent or capable than maybe we actually are.
Yeah.
So all of those have evidence for them, and I think that there's reasons for them. My favorite explanation is something called a resource slack. And this is an idea that we all have resources available to us, cognitive resources, time resources, financial resources. And so when we have to do something, like when we're agreeing to do some job, some work, we need to do this mental calculation, like, do I have the resources available to buy this thing or to do this job? And when we're on a short time horizon, then we have a pretty good sense of how our resources are laid out. You know what you're obligated to do over the next week, for example, or you know how much money you have in your bank account right now. But the farther we get out, then the worse we are at projecting how many resources we'll have available to us at that point in the future, and the more optimistic we get about how many of those resources that we'll have. And so that creates this idea that, oh, well, I'll have plenty of time to do that. And so what ends up happening because of that resource lack, like right now, if I asked you, hey, would you be able to create an entirely new keynote speech from scratch for next week? You now are engaging in a trade-off process where you go, I don't have the resources for that. So in order to do that, I would need to not do something else. In the future, we don't do that. We just say, is it worth doing that thing or not? Not what would I need to give up in order to be able to do that?
It is. That's interesting, isn't it? Because it's a balance between the two. And you could argue that you should not. So just thinking about that keynote, you shouldn't think about what do I have to give up? Because if it's worth it, then it's the balance. It is that trade-off between the two, isn't it? Because if it's worth it, then it's worth it. If it's not, then it's not.
But when it's far enough out, we don't even recognize that there might have to be a trade-off. We instead think that, oh, we'll be able to do everything. I've talked to a colleague about this, who's found herself in the same planning fallacy situation that I did. And I think for her, a lot of times she engages in this. And again, I'm not trying to pick on her. I think we all do this. But, an opportunity comes up and it's like, oh, is this a good opportunity? Like, yes or no? Should I do this? Yes or no? Is this worthy? As opposed to within all of the portfolio of everything I've committed to do, is this additional cost something that I can bear? If you look at everything individually, then there's lots of stuff that's worthy of our time. When you look at it collectively, you realize you need to make some trade-offs.
I think the other thing that's interesting, and again, I'm thinking about this from a customer experience perspective, is this organizations seem to lack the planning across silos.
Yeah.
So I remember, it's going to show my age now. I remember, so I used to work in telecoms, as you're aware, And I remember when broadband was first launched. Okay. And it was appalling because it had never been done before at scale, and bits came in from all over the place. And I think the issue becomes that you when you're in a silo, and you're trying to provide a custom experience across the piece. You're in this silo, and you're going, well, I can do my bit,
Yeah.
and it's going to be that. Surely these other parts of the organization can do it faster, or
Yeah.
why do they need so much time to do that? So I don't know, let's assume that you've got 3 month window and you can say yes, by the time you sign on the dotted line, Mr. Customer, it's a 3 month implementation. Well, I know my bit is going to take a month, but why is it, that's sacrosanct, we can't move that, but everybody else can move their stuff and
Yes.
do it shorter? Because I don't understand why engineering are taking 3 weeks to do that. That's very simple. And I guess again that must be part of the issue of just not understanding the detail and how they work and all the rest of it.
Yeah. So, like, I think that this resource slack perspective helps us understand something like that. So, I have a good sense of my resources over the next 3 months, but as I'm projecting onto you, like, I only have a vague idea of what you've committed to do over the next 3 months and what you're managing. And so I might say, well, like, your part only takes 2 weeks. Like,
Sure.
if I've got a month that I can get this done, and clearly you can do that, not knowing that, your division has overcommitted already for the next 6 months. And so adding
Sure.
in an additional thing. So yeah, I think that this idea that, there, we need to coordinate resources, not just within any silo, but coordinate resources across the silos, starts to make this a little bit more concrete, and
Yes.
really help to kind of help with our planning for this, as opposed to just this abstract, like, yeah, 3 months, like 2 weeks here and a week there.
Which is why at the end of the day you have project managers.
Yeah. Yeah.
I have to say, when we go into a client and they go, yeah, we got a project manager, or they've done lean or whatever it may be, you go, great, because now I know it's going to be done properly.
Yeah.
And they're taking the bigger picture and pulling all those things together.
So what you're
So the
suggesting,
secret
Colin, is that I hire a project manager for my life.
And the other takeaway I'm taking from this, mate, is that I just need to book in loads of recording time for you for 6 months' time, because then when it comes to then you'll just have to do it, and that's it.
That's right. I'm too stupid to realize I may have other things going on in 6 months that are. So yeah, let's do it. 6 months. Yeah.
You said it, not me, mate.
I mean, you and I wrote a book together, Colin, and we both suffered from the planning fallacy in the course of writing that book. I remember sitting
We
down and
did.
going, "Oh, this should take this amount of time,"
Yeah,
and
we
both of us
we
going,
can.
"Yep, yep, it should all."
Yeah, we can
And
knock
that was
this
my
out this
first book,
afternoon.
but that was like your seventh book or something. So you should have known
Listen,
better.
don't tell people that. I was coming out of this quite good. Everyone was thinking that I'm wonderful at planning, and now you've revealed all my dark and dirty secrets.
I know. Why would I possibly have wanted to do that? I don't know.
Good. So, any key takeaways that you want to just reinforce from your problems that you've had recently?
I mean, don't be like me. Um, I mean, one cool excuse me. One second.
Well, let me, whilst you're doing that,
Yeah.
in fact, well, yeah, let me go back to what I think is brilliant, is this Stephen Covey thing, which is important and urgent. Plot your tasks based around the importance of the task and the urgency of the task. What we tend to do is spend 80% of our time doing things that are important and urgent, whereas if we'd done a number of those when they were not urgent, that would save us a hell of a load of time. We spend far too much time in that quadrant, basically.
Yeah. Well, and the really dangerous quadrant is the urgent but not important. And I think
Yes.
we spend a lot of time there too.
Yes,
Um,
I
I,
agree. And one of the things I learned from that, I think that was in the book again, was important to who.
yes.
So is it important? It may be important to the person asking you to do it, but is it important to you as an individual? And if it's not, then why are you doing it? And I think just based upon that, I think going back to it, sometimes when somebody's asking us to do something that's 6 months out, we tend to, you tend to give in a bit, don't you? You tend to lax on that. Well, okay, I'll do you a favor, but you don't realize that the favor is going to take you forever to do, basically.
Yeah, it's a great one. The insight that I would leave people with is this idea that we are sometimes different people in the future than we are now.
Sure.
We think of ourselves that way too. Like, oh, future me will be able to handle this. Like, no problem. And so to try to take the perspective of now me when I'm thinking about things in the future, and recognizing that our natural tendency is to be optimistic about the future and our ability to do things. And so whatever your natural inclination is, maybe dial that back a little bit. Maybe think about that a little.
Good advice. We hope that's been of use, and we hope you don't suffer from it anymore. I'm sure you will. But we hope it's been of use, and we look forward to chatting to you next week. Cheers. Thanks so much for watching. And if you enjoyed this video, please make sure you subscribe so you don't miss an episode.